I don't know if you all brought your copies of The Power Broker with you, but please do read along with me. There are only 50 chapters. We'll begin on page 1. The working lifespan of the element force that was Robert Moses defied comparison with the working lifespan of other men. Robert Moses had been in power shaping Long Island in 1924. He was in power tirelessly shaping not only Long Island, but the great city stretching out toward it in 1934, and in 1944, and 1954, and 1964, until 1968. Other men hold real power, shaping power, executive authority for 4, 8, 12 years. Robert Moses held shaping power over New York metropolitan region for 44 years. Was the tirelessly work that he compared to in the duration comparable to a natural force? So was the result of that work, the sum total of the accomplishment of the things that he got done. As natural forces shaped the city and the suburbs east of the Hudson, the 2,100 square mile region on which 1974 dwelt more than 12 million human beings, as did he changed the course of rivers, filling in the beds of the Harlem and the Bronx, and cutting new channels for them, shoving one side of the mighty St. Lawrence, making new curves in the swift Niagara. He filled in the city's frayed edges, transforming into solid earth Great Kills on Staten Island, the Flushing Meadows in Queens, a dozen other vast marshes. Nature gave the region one shoreline, he gave it another, closing inlets in the barrier breaches, cutting new inlets, reshaping miles of beach dunes. For mile after mile, the earth and rock that constitute the shoreline of Brooklyn and Queens and of Manhattan's Hudson Shore are his. The cement and steel that hold them in place are his. The grass and shrubs and trees that adorn them are his, as are the concrete and steel of the marinas, the shorelines, the overlooks, the parking fields, the bicycle paths, the runways, the airport terminals, and of course, the shoreline parkways. Not nature, but he put them there. His bridges bound together Long Island and the mainland of the continent, torn apart by glaciers eons before. His causeways reunited the island with its barrier beach. He hacked out lagoons, filled lakes, made beaches, welded islands together. At Inwood Hill, he cut through the primeval forest substantially unaltered by the hand of man since the dawn of time. He altered the region's skyline, leveling great areas of low and regular tenement foothills and replacing them with slim, tall spires of 200 and 300 feet high, civic and culture edifices, great groves of apartment houses. By the close of the age of Moses, for example, the skyline along much of the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, that was the heart of metropolis, a skyline that was, to a great extent, Governor Smith houses, LaGuardia houses, Corlear Hook houses, Baruch houses, Lillian Wald houses, Jacob Riz houses, Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, Bellevue Hospital, NYU Bellevue Medical Center, the United Nations, Rockefeller Institute, New York Hospital, East River houses, Woodrow Wilson houses, Senator Robert F. Wagner Sr. houses, Abraham Lincoln houses, Riverton houses, North Harlem houses, Harlem River houses, Colonial Park houses. Well, you get the idea. For miles and miles at a time, a Robert Moses creation. Do forces of nature, volcanoes, earthquakes, avalanches, destroy whole towns and villages, forcing populations to flee? What force destroyed Sunset Park, the Syrian Quarter near the Battery, or a dozen other neighborhoods as big as towns? Robert Moses believed his works would make his name immortal, and he may well have been right. And not just because some of them were named after him. The roads of Rome stood for 2,000 years or more. Who would predict less of the roads of Moses? Who would predict less for his Shea Stadium? A structure consciously shaped to resemble Rome's Colosseum because he was afraid that his convention center office tower, called the Colosseum, didn't make the comparison clear enough. As for the parks he created, fly over New York in the year 1999 and the 2,000 acres of Brookhaven Park and the 4,000 acres of Conquet on Long Island and the 21,000 other acres of park that Robert Moses wrested away from the developer's bulldozer to ensure that the people of New York would always have green space and still be green, a tribute to his foresight. For how long will the great bridges that he built, the Verrazano, the Triborough, the Whitestone, the Throgs Neck, the Henry Hudson, the Cross Bay, the Marine endure? Life of a suspension bridge, engineers tell us, is measureless. Atomic attack or natural catastrophe could render all New York shapeless. Barring such monumental calamity in centuries to come, discerning historians will, if they look for it, be able to see writ plain through the great city and the suburbs evidence of the shaping hand of Robert Moses. Other great builders left their mark on physical New York, but the achievement of even the greatest, a Zeckendorf or a Helmsley or a Winston or a Lafrac, or the Rockefellers of Rockefeller Center, is dwarfed by the achievement of Robert Moses. Not even the greatest of the public officials who, while not builders themselves, shaped the growth of the city, the almost forgotten father of New York, Andrew H. Green, and the greatest mayor New York has ever had, Fiorello H. LaGuardia, had a fraction of Moses' influence on the shape of New York. The shapers closest to him in total influence are probably the robber barons, who built the railroads into the city and throughout its suburbs, and who erected monuments to themselves in great skyscrapers and terminals. But the influence of any one of them is dwarfed by his. To compare the works of Robert Moses to the works of man, one has to compare them not to the works of individual men, but to the combined total work of the era, the yardstick by which his public housing and Title I feats can be best measured, for example, is the age of skyscrapers, which reared up the greatest mass of stone and steel and concrete over Manhattan in quantity comparable to his. The yardstick by which the influence of his highways can best be gauged is by the age of railroads. But Robert Moses did not build only housing projects and highways. Robert Moses built parks and playgrounds and beaches and parking lots and cultural centers and the civic centers and the United Nations building and Shea Stadium and the Coliseum. And he also swept away neighborhoods to clear way for Lincoln Center and the mid-city campuses of 4 separate universities. He was a shaper of not of the sections of a city, but of a city. He was, for the greatest city in the Western world, the city shaper, the only city shaper. In sheer physical impact on New York and the entire New York metropolitan region, he is comparable not to the works of any man or group or even a generations of man. In the shaping of New York, Robert Moses was comparable only to some elemental force of nature. But if in the shaping of New York, Robert Moses was an elemental force, he was also a blind force, blind and deaf to reason, to argument, to new ideas, to any ideas except his own. He made himself blind. He possessed vision in a measure possessed by very few men, but he wouldn't use it. The arrogance which had been his characteristic from youth, the arrogance which was most striking characteristically of his mother and grandmother, the arrogance that had led his relatives to call him Bella Moses' son. The arrogance that had gorged on power, swelling with each increase, had now that his power in his chosen fields of activity was so absolute, become absolute itself. No rules, not even the most innocuous, could apply to him. As he was above the rules, he was above the law. He had always felt himself above it, ignored its spirit whenever possible. But now there was a new depth to this feeling, a new intensity to the particular manifestation of arrogance. Confronted in building up the base for the Idlewild Airport by the same problem by which he had confronted the building of the base for Jones Beach, the sand that he imported blew away because it was not anchored, as it was in Long Island's natural dunes, by the horizontal growing roots of beach grass. Moses, without bothering to obtain anyone's permission, dispatched teams to obtain the grass from public beaches owned by Suffolk County and from beaches of the summer homes owned by private families. W. Kingsland Macy, yes, that Macy, an ardent conservative who knew the value of beach grass and what would happen to the dunes if they suddenly denuded of it, was enraged by this when he learned that scores of Long Island State Park Commission employees out on their hands and knees illegally yanking out the beach sands and that Macy wanted to preserve in perpetuity for the people of his county. He ordered County Attorney Edgar Hazelton, who ordered Moses to desist on pain of arrest and imprisonment of any commission employee caught, and on Moses himself. Now, Moses' reply was not long in coming. The next weekend, when the Hazeltons arrived at their summer home in West Hampton, they discovered Moses' men yanking out the grass on their beach. The practice was finally ended when Macy ordered local police to arrest 13 of Moses' grass pullers. The measure of his arrogance was taken by a dictator. Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina was considering commissioning Moses to propose public works for his Dominican Republic, when after one long afternoon of discussion with Moses, he abruptly told him that he has decided not to hire him after all. According to Moses, the dictator told him, "You'd want my job." Thank you.
This is an audience of card-carrying Caro fans. So I know that much of the history of this magisterial book is familiar already. Everything about the story around the power broker, like everything about the book and about its subject, is epic, except, of course, for the size of your advance. But I do want to ask one question about origins. You've said that well before you write, you settle on a theme. And that theme is distilled into a few paragraphs. 7 years of work will eventually flow from 2 or 3 paragraphs. And those paragraphs may take you weeks to formulate. You keep them always close at hand. They drive the book all the way through. And you write about them reverentially, as if they're like the bouillon cube that flavors the entire book. So can you tell us a little bit about them and how they evolve? And is there one sitting on your desk right now?
Well, I hope there's one sitting on my desk right now.
So do we.
But I found out that I had to have that when I was doing The Power Broker. When I had been doing all this research for years, now it was time to sit down and write the book, and I couldn't figure out how to do it, how to organize all this massive material. I really was stuck. At that time, of course, Commissioner Moses had stopped talking to me years before. But whenever he appeared in public or gave a speech, I would go and listen to it. And one day he was giving a speech at an exedra, which is called a memorial bench in Flushing Meadow Park. He was dedicating it. And the subject of his speech was the ingratitude of the public towards great men. In fact, he turned to Cardinal Spellman and said, "Someday you and I will sit on this beach, on this bench, and discuss why people are more grateful to great men." And in the front two rows, I was sort of sitting in the back of the audience. Front two rows were what was called the Moses men, his architects, his engineers. They were mostly gray-headed by that time also. And when he said that, you could see them all nodding and whispering to each other, why, that's right, why weren't they grateful? And when I saw, in an instant, when I heard that sentence, I said, I don't think I said anything, all of a sudden, I knew how to do the book. That was the theme of the book. He had done so much, and why weren't they grateful? I remember I just sort of hurried back to my office as fast as I could and started outlining the book, and it was very simple to outline it from beginning to end, just as you see it, except, of course, for the chapters I had to cut out. But since then, I've learned that I can't start the book until I have the last sentence. And once I have it, I write the whole book towards it.
That's a daunting thought. So let me.
That's a what?
That's a very daunting thought. But let me go back to something else which touches on the beginning. It seems to me that it is incumbent, it is required of the biographer to supply a kind of appropriate childhood for his subject. So for example, if you're writing about Charles Lindbergh, you need to see him as a toddler cutting out designs of and decorating his room with little paper airplanes or something. Or if you're writing about LBJ, he might, for example, just happen to steal a student council election while still an undergraduate by blackmailing his opponent. So in the first pages of The Power Broker, as everyone in this room could recite by heart, Robert Moses storms out of a heated disagreement at the Yale pool, never to swim again for Yale, in precisely the same way that he'll be walking around threatening to resign 750 pages later, by which time he has completely perfected the arms around the chest, excellent sulk act. Were you well into the project before you realized, we now know you had your last 9, but did you realize that the book had to open with that Yale temper tantrum?
Well, I don't remember at what point I realized that, but of course, I had watched him do the same thing to Mayor Wagner, to hand him a piece of paper and say, if you don't sign it appointing me to my whatever third position or whatever, I'll resign. And when I thought, it was very hard to get Moses' classmates to talk to me. But when I talked to the captain of the swimming team and he told me this story, just as the same thing had happened, you didn't have to be very smart to say, this is a great scene to open the book with.
Do you ever have a problem with a minor character? And I'm thinking here, for example, of Al Smith, making off with the narrative. And how do you keep yourself from letting him get away with that?
Well, I don't.
Oh, that would explain the 1,162 pages.
But I wrote an awful lot more on Al Smith. I fell in love with Al Smith.
It's hard not to.
And I realized, Oscar Handlin said Al Smith is the major American political figure most forgotten by history. I knew nothing about Al Smith. But Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, said to Francis Perkins, Francis, 90% of everything we did in the New Deal, Al Smith did first in New York. And Robert Moses, when he would talk about people, his whole voice changed. it was the only time his voice was sort of nice. And he called him the governor, and he would tell me anecdotes about him. And I've been sorry to this day that I haven't been able to do a biography of Al Smith. And of course, I wrote more in answer to your question. I wrote a great deal more on Al Smith, and then when it became necessary, when I realized I had to cut so many hundreds of thousands of words out of 350,000.
Not that anyone has counted them or anything.
Out of the book, you just said these biographies have to go. The same thing just happened with my book, Master of the Senate, and Richard Russell. You said Richard Russell dominated the United States Senate for 36 years. We don't even know who he is. I myself hardly knew who he was. So I'm always really feeling bad about the stuff I have to cut out, or the stuff I didn't, just said no sense putting it in. I'll have to cut it out.
But since you bring up Master of the Senate, for 100 pages, you give us a history of the United States Senate. Lyndon Johnson is barely in the picture.
Yes.
And I must say they're the most delicious pages, but did you ever worry, I'm taxing my readers' patience here? I mean, how did you know that you had the legitimacy to give us 100 pages? Obviously, you're making a point here about the shift in political power, but did you have to rein yourself in? Did you think the book just needs this foundation, I can't move on from here?
You ask terrific questions.
You're stalling for time.
So sometimes you have a moment that just changes the book, changes what you're trying to do. So I had been researching Master of the Senate for several years, and I had one idea of the book. It was more a straight biography of Lyndon Johnson, how he achieved power, what he achieved as a majority leader in the Senate. But I had never been down on the floor of the Senate when the Senate was empty. I'd been there several times when it was in session. So the historian of the Senate, then a wonderful guy named Don Ritchie, I asked him, could I go down when the Senate wasn't in session? And he took me down, and I remember we walked down, you come in the side door, you walk down to the well of the Senate, and I turned around, and suddenly there were the arcs, these 4 great arcs of the Senate. And I remember thinking of this sentence: Webster's hand rested on one of those desks when he rose to answer Hayne. And all of a sudden I said, this book has to be about, you want to talk about someone who turned the Senate into a functioning, dominant force in government. You have to talk about what the Senate is. And I just decided to do it.
And you didn't think, I have to rein this in? Did you limit yourself? I have 100 pages here. Did you know what form it was going to take?
No.
Okay. So on the subject of things that are left out or not left out, Paul Moses is a charming, handsome man, fluent in Greek and Latin, an electrical engineer by training, and it turns out that he's Robert Moses's brother. Who knew Robert Moses even had siblings or a birth family? So, because Moses wanted the world to think the brother didn't exist, I take it. And Moses seems to operate as if there is no family. Paul is missing from the only biography of Robert Moses that precedes yours, right?
Yes.
So I want to know more about your decision to stash Paul away until page 576. He's invisible until chapter 26, which is midway through the book. And then it turns out that you had 11 interviews with him. So first of all, could you tell us a little bit about him? And also, had he been waiting for Robert Caro to come along? Was he willing to talk? You have him returning in kind of an amazing melancholy scene.
Well, he had been waiting for someone to come along. The phone rang one day, and he said, "This is Paul Moses," and he said that he wanted to see me, and I said I was going to come down immediately to see him. he didn't want me to see where he lived, so he was insistent that we meet in a restaurant. And there was this man who was, I remember he was wearing a tweed, wonderful suit, except the edges of the collar were frayed. And he told me this horrible story about how his brother had cheated out of his inheritance so he could go on with his public career and keep saying, I'm not interested in money. And I didn't really believe this story. It sounded too horrible to me. Mm-hmm. But he said, I have all the papers. And he did. And so we made a date. The next time we were sitting at a table, I read through the papers, I knew the story, and I remember I walked him back to his place where he lived. He lived at the very last house at South Ferry on the 5th floor of a 5-story walk-up. And he was then, we'll say in the book, I think he was about 80 years old. And he couldn't walk up those 5 flights. At each landing, we had to stop while he caught his breath enough to go up. Now, that was a time where his brother was building thousands, tens of thousands. You know, Robert Moses built the figures in the book, I think 148,000 apartments housing 500,000 people are in low income, and Mitchell-Lama, built by Robert Moses. So we became, they were very, you asked, there are things that are interesting to find out in a book, and there are things that are so sad, poignant, that you never forget them. And my interviews with Paul Moses were those kinds of things. And they were made even more poignant, Stacy, because he so reminded me of Robert Moses. They both had this way of throwing their head back like this and going like this to the table when they wanted to make a point. So you said they were so alike, you know, and I'm done.
Okay. The biographer, pretty much until recently anyway, has kept himself off the page, except maybe in the introduction to his book or her book. And for the most part, you do so in The Power Broker, but you also break the fourth wall, periodically, inserting yourself into the picture. At one point, the author even admits to his frustration that he's searching for a unifying concept for a series of articles and unable to find one. That's, in fact, while you're interviewing Paul Moses. That's when you really step out from behind the curtain, it seems to me, and take your place in the picture, and you write yourself into a scene with Robert Moses. You're beginning to prod him, and you can see his charm, the charm level evaporating in front of your very eyes. And then at one point, we get a glimpse of someone else altogether. We see a young reporter assigned to cover an otherwise vacant Newsday desk, and that happens to be Bob Caro in disguise, although he's referred to only as the young reporter. So did you feel it was essential or reassuring for us to see the author at work? I mean, was that a decision that you made? Did that come about just naturally to put yourself in the book in this sort of indirect way?
Say again what scene?
There's the scene where you're talking to Moses, and you're watching, as you're prodding him with questions, you're watching the charm reservoir deplete itself. And then there's the scene where you're a young reporter. You basically say, a young reporter at Newsday, and it's obviously you, but you don't tell us who it is in the text of the book. It's very coy, Bob, actually.
Well, I try to keep myself out of the books. Mm-hmm. I don't know if, I'd like to say I never use the word I, you know.
Oh, so that's why it's the young reporter.
But there were a couple of scenes in The Power Broker where it was necessary to put myself in the book to explain to the reader why I'm seeing what I'm seeing. And of course, interviewing Robert Moses was quite a dramatic thing in itself. When you interviewed him, in his summer home, which was in Oak Beach, beyond Jones Beach. He had torn out, he lived in a very modest summer cottage, but he had torn out 2 walls in the living room and replaced them with picture windows. And out the left window was the Robert Moses Causeway, the bridge to Fire Island, and out the right window was the tower of Robert Moses State Park. So he sat in this big leather chair in the corner, Robert Moses surrounded by his monuments, and talked to you. But they were amazing interviews. The book would not, I don't think, have been, I wouldn't have been able to understand Moses as to whatever extent I did if I hadn't had those interviews, because there were, for one thing, you felt his genius. When he would start talking about things, I mean, one day he was still, he's then, what, 80? I remember he was talking about, he originally envisioned a road all the way from Staten Island to Montauk Point, the continuous road. And and so he had built the Staten Island Expressway, then the Verrazano Bridge, then the Belt Parkway, then the Southern State Parkway. But he was stymied because he hadn't built it down the length of Fire Island. Of course, the road he wanted to build was in some places wider than Fire Island. But while I was interviewing, it was the time when the Fire Island people were protesting and stopping him. And I remember him coming over to me and grabbing my arm and leading me out to the deck and pointing and saying, "Can't you see there ought to be a road there?" So you felt the force of the man, and in each of his offices, he had behind him this gigantic map of New York and its environs. And he was like a kid. If he started to tell you about something, he'd jump up. He always had a number of his aides sitting there. So he would go like this. And into his palm, someone would put a pencil. And he would say, "You see, if I build the park here, we can have the housing here, and the bridge could go over there." And I remember he did this one day with a group of Japanese planners. They had come, a delegation from Japan had come, and they wanted to see him. And I remember they had a problem of connecting an island to the mainland somewhere. I don't remember the details. And he started doing it. He says, "Well, you can do it this way, and if you do it that way, you can have the park over here." And this is, and I remember thinking, this is a kind of genius. We think of a genius, a Mozart or a Beethoven, or writers who are geniuses. This is a different kind of genius. It's a man who can look at this entire huge region and see it as one picture. And he makes a plan for it in 1924 and spends the next 44 years filling in the parts of that plan. I said, so if the book is going to be honest, I have to show the genius of this man, of the city shaper. Anyway, in the end, sorry, I went on too long.
That's why we're here.
Well,
but since you're on the subject of interviewing him, I think this is something you may want to talk about. Can you talk for a minute about one of my favorite people in the book, Otto Kahn and Cold Spring Harbor, and Otto Kahn's and the Northern State Parkway and Kahn's private golf course? Because I think this is a minor episode in the book, but a major episode in the life of Robert Caro.
You're right. Well, okay, so Robert Moses had refused to talk to me, for several years. And then finally, his daughter called me one day and said, Papa Bear, she called him Papa Bear, Papa Bear will talk to you if he can have the right to approve the book. And I said, well, no, he can't have the right to approve the book. And she said, well, then he'll never talk to you. And she slammed down the phone. About a couple of weeks later, she called and she said, well, he'll talk to you as long as he has the right to see the book and edit it. And I said, no, he can't see the book and edit it. And she said, then I'll never talk to you. So this went on for some time, and finally, he did talk to me. And I, of course, was mesmerized by the force of this genius talking to me. These interviews were so valuable to me.
These were long interviews, too.
Long interviews, all-day interviews. He would start talking, and he just poured out of him. And you know, he had this terrific memory. Like you'd be saying something about a vote in the legislature to approve Jones Beach. I remember this. And he says, it was 8-7 against us in Ways and Means, but the eighth vote was Stevens of Cattaraugus County. And Stevens had a farm, and the farm had a mortgage, and the weight of that mortgage was the Rochester First City Bank. So we had Stevens. So it was wonderful to hear him going along. It was also, if I can answer your question in a long way, it was horrible because if you know the chapter 1 Mile about all the people who were thrown out for the Cross Bronx Expressway, so many of them were elderly couples. They were lower middle income people, garment workers, most of them. And I was trying to find them and talk to them. And over again, the words you would hear was lonely, were so lonely. Because in East Tremont, where the Cross Bronx Expressway ran through, you went to school with the same kids that you grew up with often, and you had a community there. The girls, they called themselves the girls, all sat on the benches on Southern Boulevard. And now they were alone. They were living in Co-op City, or they were living with their kids in White Plains or something. And I had 2 interviews with 2 couples that morning. And the word I kept hearing over and over again was lonely. And it's my feeling that that's a word that nobody uses about themselves unless they're very lonely. And that afternoon, I had the interview with Robert Moses, and I asked him about relocating the families from East Tremont. I remember him saying, oh, there was very little hardship there at all. It was all exaggerated. All they did was stir up the animals, so I just held fast, and I won. So you had that kind of insight into him also. And now I've forgotten your exact question.
I don't remember it either. I don't remember it either. But you just touched on a contradiction that fascinates, I think, most of us. Moses grows up amid great privilege, and he builds playgrounds and beaches and pools and the Central Park Zoo, where I was earlier today. And he even goes so far as to arrange those little whimsical refreshment carts in the zoo with the faux Sicilian outfits for the operators and the garlands of flowers and the whirligigs. So he likes the public, but he dislikes the people who make up the public. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And especially if they are people of color, right?
Yeah.
So I think this comes up all the time. This comes up with the swimming pools. This comes up with where Park Avenue covers the railroad tracks, right? How did you deal with that? I mean, I'm assuming that this came up in the interviews with him as well. Certainly it would have come up in the writing.
Well, Robert Moses was the most racist human being that I've ever encountered. I mean, trying to think what's in the book. I remember he had one telephone on his desk with only one line. So if you were a mayor or a governor, you had to wait until he was done with the previous call. And he had just been speaking to someone. I never realized, I didn't know if it was the governor or the mayor. And this is very painful sentence to say. He slammed down the phone and he said, they expect me to build playgrounds for that scum floating up from Puerto Rico. And he was very unashamed of his racism. And that's about all. And I mean, his public works show his racism.
I want to go back to the racism, but it was Otto Kahn we left.
Oh.
By the side of the road there. I wouldn't want him to fall by the side of the road.
Otto
and
Kahn.
why Otto Kahn matters to you is what I wanted to get to.
So we had 7 interviews, long interviews, and as I say, they were all very revealing of both sides, of all sides of Robert Moses. I had found out that when he was building the Northern State Parkway, the legislature was trying to stop him because the robber barons of the 1920s lived in the Northern State was running right past their estates, and they were afraid that what they called the rabble from New York City would be brought to Long Island. And they, at one point, they cut off his funds for surveys so the parkway couldn't proceed. And the route of the parkway, Otto Kahn, this great financier of the 1920s, hugely rich man, had a private 18-hole golf course on his estate in Dix Hills, was it? And the Northern State Parkway would have run right through it. And he gave Moses he offered Moses, and Moses accepted, $10,000, not for Moses, but for the Long Island State Park Commission, to do surveys to find a route that wouldn't go through his golf course. And I worded it with all the delicacy that was in me, but Robert Moses was a lot smarter than me. And as soon as the words Otto Kahn came out of my mouth, I saw his face change. And shortly after that, he said, well, that's enough for today. And I never saw him again.
Also on the subject of the interviews, this seems to be the right intimate forum to ask you an intimate trade secret. There's nothing more difficult in biography than documenting what happens when your subject is alone. And this is why writing about writers and artists is such a feat, because what they are doing is so invisible and inaccessible. At an early point in the book, you have Moses taking a cab not straight home from the Bureau of Municipal Research in his first years in New York, but to Riverside Drive at 67th Street to look out over the bluff at that muddy wasteland, which was called Riverside Park, euphemistically in those days. And you have him out there on this bluff just walking and dreaming. You do it again on Jones Beach later with kind of the wind rustling through his hair. It's extraordinarily dramatic. Did he tell you this? You weren't with him, obviously.
Did he tell me what?
How did you get these scenes?
How
did you manage to paint those scenes? Did he?
Well, he told me about going. He spoke at length about how he dreamed of a park, Riverside Park, that was a wasteland, and what was that? The rest of the question there.
Well, you do it again on Jones Beach.
Oh,
you have him. It's like a Walt Whitman-esque scene.
Yeah. Well, he told me, he had a wonderful gift for words, Robert Moses. So key scenes, sometimes you get, you find one person who can say something to you, and I was trying to find the Riverside Park. I was trying to find everybody from. Moses worked for the Bureau of Municipal Research, so I was trying to find anybody who was alive. Very depressing. There's a roster of like 27 members, and you're crossing them off one by one. But there was one Ernie Wilbon-Cedar who was alive, and he told me one day about how he told me how Robert Moses would come back and talk to him about Riverside Park. And then one day he said, he came in, he was all excited, and he said to me, Al Smith listens to me. And you said, that explains an awful lot of what happens. So if you find the one person who can describe something to you. And Moses was wonderful in describing things himself, So I'm done.
That's kind of biographical gold. I mean, that's as close as you ever come, I think, as a biographer to hearing your subject singing in the shower, right? Those scenes where you have him alone thinking or dreaming or whatever. I don't want to fail to salute your chapter titles. The Curator of Cauliflowers, Rumors and the Report of Rumors, The Meat Axe, The Best Bill Drafter in Albany. You seem to have a lot of fun with the chapter titles. Do they arrive early or as early as your outline, or do they set you on your initial course in some way, or do they bubble up later?
They just come out. They just come out of me when I'm doing the chapter. Yeah.
Robert Caro, ladies and gentlemen. You begin Path to Power by promising that this 3-volume work will proceed as Dumas Malone did with Thomas Jefferson. And for the audience, Malone's was another magisterial project. He produced a 6-volume life of Thomas Jefferson, published between 1948 and 1981. And those volumes were also written, I should say, in longhand, at a rate, at least toward the end of his life, of about 500 words a day when Malone was nearly blind. And he also said that he came to admire Jefferson more the more he wrote. But leaving aside the blindness, does that project ring any bells? Was it a project you especially admired? Because it is one book you reference early on.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Dumas Malone, his
Dumas
Jefferson
Malone,
project.
yes.
And you cite him in the early pages when you start out with Jefferson. And I just wondered if, when you start out, with Johnson, and I wondered if that had been if that book had a talismanic quality or a certain literary appeal to you, or if it had shown the way.
Not Dumas Malone so much, but James Thomas Flexner, who wrote a 4-volume biography of George Washington. I worked in the same room as him, the Frederick Lewis Allen room at the New York Public Library. And I got into this room after I had already been working for like about 4 years. And I was wondering what I was doing, wasting my life just writing this longer and longer thing about someone, my editor, first editor, not Bob Gottlieb, kept saying, no one's going to read a book about Robert Moses. You have to be prepared for a very small printing. And there was James Thomas Flexner, who I really admired his books on Washington. I thought they were really good. And he came over to me one day and he said, what are you doing? I said, a biography of Robert Moses. And he said, how long have you been working on it? And I said, 4 years. And he said, oh, that's not so much. I've been working for 14 years on George Washington. And all of a sudden, a weight was lifted on my shoulder.
He is the walking definition of the publisher's worst nightmare. Right? I wonder if there's a biographical sweet spot. I think there's a biographical sweet spot between the invention of the typewriter and the invention of email, and that anyone who works outside of those two periods is asking for trouble. But there's also a sweet spot in terms of a subject, I think, and when the biographer starts working on that subject. So do you feel that you hit it with Johnson? I mean, I guess I'm asking was there a relief when you started out that he had died in 1973 and you still had this vast cast of characters to interview, but you weren't going to have to contend with a subject who, like Robert Moses, hated the book you were going to write?
Well, I'm not sure I quite heard you, but when I was doing The Power Broker, sometime when I was doing the book, Stacy, I realized that what I was really interested in was political power and Moses and political power. And that was municipal city power. I really wanted to do national political power. And I knew I wanted to do it through Lyndon Johnson because he had accomplished all these things. I mean, section I recently finished, he passes in one 5-month period, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights, new immigration, it goes on forever. How did someone manage to do? So I wanted to do Lyndon Johnson. That's how I came to him.
It's convenient that that he'll never tell you that he hated the book, though, you have to admit. There's a line in Turn Every Page that there's one line that particularly surprises me, and it's when you say, it's your Paris Review interview, and you say it's easy to fool yourself into believing that you're working hard when you're not, as everyone who has email knows. But then you go on to say, and I'm naturally lazy. So this makes me wonder about how much we should believe anyone's description of him or herself. And I'm reminded of something in The Power Broker, which Robert Moses says long after he's left Yale. And he said he'd never liked New York. It was too big. The crowds, the noise, and the confusion were terrible. And he wanted to go back to New Haven and become governor of Connecticut. So I just wonder, how do you know when you should believe your subject?
Never.
That seems like a fair answer.
Well, no, you have to check everything. You know, when someone's talking about themselves, it's up to you to find out the underlying truth of what they're telling you.
Was there a mismatch between Moses' grandiosity and Moses the man? When you spoke with him, did you have this sense of double vision in a way?
Did he have, or did I?
Did you have? Were you aware of this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because you're finding out the things he did to get things done. At the same time, he's telling you about them, you know? And you're hearing this wonderful descriptions, this genius, you know, of things. And at the same time, you're knowing what really happened, what he did to the people of East Tremont. So you would really be, you'd come away very conflicted, you know, you'd come out, because he talked to me all day. I mean, these were long interviews, and questions were not necessary or allowed, actually. But you realized you were hearing how things got done in a way that you had never really dreamed before, you know? And at the same time, like in your mind at the same time, was what he did to people, you know, not just the people that he threw out of their homes, you know, but the people who stood in his way. You know, like I remember for the Cross Bronx Expressway, Mayor Wagner had appointed a deputy mayor named Henry Epstein. Let's see if I can remember this. It's 50 years ago. And Epstein gave Wagner a report saying, you know, if Moses would just move the road two blocks to the right, we have this broad boulevard, you know, why? So don't approve this. And then all of a sudden, what Epstein changes and says, yeah, whatever words I don't remember, it's good to approve Moses' route as the best route. So I asked Moses, you know, why did Epstein change? And I'm not sure that I can quite remember. It sounded like a rambling paragraph until you typed it up. And he said, oh, Epstein, you know, he was a Jewish lawyer, he said, and he had this chum of his, the assemblywoman in the next district. He said, so he stood in our way until we hit him on the head with an axe. So I said, well, what was the axe you hit him with? And he said, oh, I'm not going to tell you that, you know. But then I read my notes over and over again, and I realized that what he had done was say, we know about your affair with the assemblywoman, and if you don't approve this, and that's what in fact happened. Yeah.
A very useful axe.
Yeah.
Before Bryan comes back to read the next 400 pages.
So just to finish, so you had this, you asked about, you know, what was in your mind when you were interviewing him. You were constantly, and the more research I did, of course, I knew a lot about what he had done and how he had done it. So you're playing these two things at the same time. You're looking at this guy, and realizing what he would do. At the same time, you were in awe of the genius with which he was doing it.
I have one last question, then I'll turn to the audience questions. You've spent decades with two ruthless, domineering, grudge-sharpening, vindictive, abrasive, contemptuous men who reorganize politics to their own ends and who are unencumbered by philosophy or ideology, who conceal their aims as they trample norms and dismantle institutions. Both of them experts in protective coloration, both of them great outsiders, men who like to attach their names to things, one of whom routinely undermined the democratic processes of a major city. So do you avoid the news, or do you find that it enhances your research?
Do
you avoid the news, or do you find it actually enhances what you're doing?
The news, as I read it in the paper every morning?
Yes, that news.
Well, you feel to the, well, right now, this is a perfect time because I write about the Senate a lot, and the Senate is going to turn out to be the obstacle, or not the obstacle, to Donald Trump. And the Senate is a fascinating institution, and you feel, I'm watching this play out, the battle over the nominees, and I'm thinking of other battles that played out, and you feel, I know more about what's going on in the committee rooms, and I can visualize that, so it's sort of fascinating to me,
One member of the audience would like to know what we're all wondering, which is, will we ever get to read the chapters that were cut from the book? Okay, several members of the audience would like to.
I'm afraid not. I'll explain it this way. Cutting the 300, we had to cut out 350,000 words, and it took months and months to do that. So if you looked at Bob Gottlieb's office at the close of the days, there'd be papers strewn all over them. There'd be one page, there'd be 10 pages bound that I had to cut down to one page, and the thing, there'd be whole sections cut out. And I guess after I went home every day, someone from Knopf came in, and because after the book, not before it came out, but after we finished editing it, there suddenly arrived at our apartment in Riverdale 2 huge boxes. And I couldn't bear to open them. So I bought cedar-lined trunks, tin trunks, and I just dumped the papers in there. And while I thought there were some whole power chapters, in one place, the archivists who are going through them say, it's all a mess. It's really messy.
You've made life very miserable for your biographer. What are some similarities and differences between Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson? Compare and contrast Johnson and Moses.
Well, in some ways, they're the most opposite of people. You have Robert Moses, went to Oxford, wrote a brilliant senior thesis, was an idealist, very much an idealist until Tammany Hall broke him, and he learned that you couldn't be an idealist and get things done. This wonderful woman who's forgotten by history, but is arguably the most powerful woman of the 1920s, Belle Moskowitz, takes him in hand and teaches him how to get things done. And then you have Lyndon Johnson, who basically is a political expert from the time he's a boy, you know, from the time he gets in college. Always secretive, desperately ambitious for himself, you know, in many ways, and comes from the hill country, very little education. The college he went to is like a high school that we would be familiar with. But they're alike to me in that they're both, as I keep saying, probably boring you, political geniuses. Lyndon Johnson figures out how to make the Senate work. Robert Moses figures out how to get public works built. They're very different things, but it requires both of them to look at the established, seemingly impregnable institutions, the Southern control of the Senate, all the forces that stand in the way of getting anything built in New York, and finding their way around it. And you know, to me, it's just, I have to say, it's fascinating to watch, try to figure out how they figured out how to do it. Yeah.
In the sense that you can distill that kind of genius, is that a people-reading genius, or is that vision that you mentioned of IQ?
Yeah, an opposite. Opposite. In Lyndon Johnson, it's a people-reading genius. You know, that's the way he was. He comes to the Senate, and he's just been elected. He walks in on the Senate's not in session. He comes to Washington. He opens the door on the side of the Senate, steps through. With him is his aide, Walter Jenkins, thank goodness, who talked to me. And he says, and Johnson says, just the right size. And Jenkins knows exactly what he means. This is a small enough number of men so Lyndon Johnson can work on them individually. And nobody, and George Brown of Brown and Root said, you know, Johnson was the best ever one-on-one, you know. Moses was the opposite. I was in Moses' office when a delegation of somebody came in, I don't remember who, and one of the politicians came running over to hug him, and Moses instinctively stepped back like this. So you say Lyndon Johnson's gesture was arm around the shoulder, pull you in. Moses, it's personal things. I'm gonna get what I want from you in a personal way. Find out what you need, what you're afraid of, right? Moses was the opposite. He didn't want to deal with individuals. He wanted to go in a room with a legal pad and write laws that gave him power that nobody understood. So in some ways, they are the exact opposites. Some ways, they're very much the same.
You've interviewed so many notable and interesting people for your books. Who was the most disappointing? and P.S., we love you.
Who was the most disappointing to find out about?
Well, actually, that could be read two ways. Who was the most disappointing interview, but who was the most disappointing? But it could be who was the most, in whom did you have the most faith, with whom you were later so disillusioned, is the way I'm reading the question.
Yeah, well, I'm a very persistent interviewer. And I know what I'm trying to find out, and I try to stay there until I find it out.
That's what we're going to be doing here tonight.
Yeah. But
who was the most disappointed? Or was there a disappointment among the interviews of somebody whom you thought was going to reveal the golden secret who somehow didn't come up with the goods?
Well, a number, off the top of my head, the older senators that were still like Robert Byrd, who I really wanted to talk to about what the Senate was like decades before they were still there. They sort of had real contempt. You could see it in their eyes for someone just another reporter. I remember the Senate historian would try to explain to them that I was writing a book, but I was just a guy with a notebook and a pad, and they treated me sort of with contempt. And I generally, when I would type up my interviews, there were very little, off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a better answer, but I can't think of it right now.
Have the events of the last few years altered your views on how power is acquired and exercised?
The events of the last few years now seem to mean only Trump, you know? The events of, so I have to think by what you mean by the events of the last few years. You know, you're constantly frustrated because you've written about a president who got so much done, okay? And you're saying, why can't the presidents today get things done, you know? Get more things done. And you don't know how they should get more things done, you know, but you know there are ways to do it. You don't know it. Maybe there are things they have to figure out for themselves, but they don't. And then if you say in city government, yes, I'm totally disappointed because I don't think New York is, you know, New York is still the most segregated, is a way of measuring this district by district. New York is the most segregated city in America. New York is a city where it's enslaved by cars. We haven't built a subway since 1940. You say, but when the war started, there were plans for more subways. Northeast and Queens, Northeast and Bronx, the Northeastern Bronx. This is 85 years later. No one is even proposing subways. So yes, I am very disappointed.
But some of that is Robert Moses' legacy, right? I mean, the traffic on the LIE is Robert Moses' legacy.
Definitely.
Segregation is Robert, I mean, a lot of this ties back
Yes.
to issues with which you dealt in the power broker.
That is correct, yes.
I mean, there's your marvelous story of how there could have been additional lanes or light rail heading out to Long Island, which Moses has made it impossible for the next 120 years for anyone ever to build, correct?
Yes. You feel that all the time. And just what you said about the Long Island Expressway. About 2 weeks ago, Ina and I were driving back from our house in eastern Long Island, and as we were driving, when we got to Port Jefferson, suddenly I was faced with 3 lanes of headlights. It was about 6 o'clock at night, solid bumper-to-bumper headlights as far as you could see. Now, Port Jefferson to commute out from New York is about 2.5 hours. So you see, the people who are doing that are giving 5 hours of the day. That's 25 hours a week. That's however 1,000 whatever hours a year of their lives. And these are tiring hours. You get home tired, not really wanting to play with your children as much as you should. And I remember when he's building the Long Island Expressway, he's buying, so 200 feet of right-of-way. So eastern Nassau County, really, and all of Suffolk County is nothing but potato fields and farms, or largely potato fields. And land is so cheap. And everybody is saying, this is hindsight, they're saying it at the time, just buy, instead of buying 200 feet of right-of-way, buy 240. 40 feet is all you need for two light rail lines. And that way, maybe you don't want to build light rail lines, but that way, if in the future someone wants to build light rail lines, they will be able to do that. And every land is so cheap that every 10 or 15 miles you can build this huge parking lot so that people can drive and leave their cars there. So you're saying these people who are giving all these hours of their lives to driving in cars, that's not necessary. It didn't have to be this way. And I could take up more of your time and show you a dozen examples, specific examples of things that he made impossible now to do because the city is built in a certain way. That's why the city, I'm able to say, I think it's correct, the city is shaped by him more than any other person.
This would seem to be the right moment to remind everyone that Robert Moses didn't drive,
Yeah.
right? And I think never noticed a traffic jam because he was too busy working in the back of the car.
That's right. He had the car designed so it was so that the windows next to the back seat were moved forward so that no one could look in, and he couldn't look out. I traveled with him once. It was like being in the room of a men's club. You know, it was upholstered in the richest leather, and he had a desk out there, and he worked all the time. So he had no idea what driving was like.
So you've set us up perfectly for the last question, which is which is the most consequential question. Would Robert Moses be an ardent supporter or an opponent of congestion pricing?
So for the last question, I'll give you the answer. I don't know.
Thank you, Bob.